situation, allow me to recommend that you hover your mouse in the upper right-hand corner of your square. You will see a blue square with 3 white dots. Click on that and rename yourself. Otherwise, you'll just get to share your name with me for today, which I'm very fine with. Welcome. Thanks. We have lots of participants. So glad everyone is here joining us today. So funny that your name is showing up as my name. If it is, feel free to change your name in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Okay, I think we should go ahead and get started. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. Brandon, do you mind throwing our slides up on the screen to share with folks?
Not at all.
Thank you. Perfect. All right, welcome. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Salton Sea, Why All of California Should Care. And I am your host, Jenny Binstock. What's really funny is that a lot of you are sharing my name today due to some weird technical difficulty. And it's really quite an experience for me seeing so many people that aren't me sharing my name. So I'm gonna really look back at this with some fond memories, but if you know how to rename yourself on Zoom, please do so. Otherwise, welcome to my world. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Jenny Binstock, along with other folks on this webinar. I am a senior campaign representative for the Sierra Club's National Lands, Water, and Wildlife campaign. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in Los Angeles, which is the traditional lands of the Tonga, Chumash, and Tataviam people. And I work on public lands issues across California in partnership with our staff, volunteers, and partners. We are delighted to have you all join us today for an important presentation about the past, present, and the future of the Salton Sea, which is California's largest inland lake, a critical stopover for migratory birds, and a unique landscape loved by both surrounding communities and visitors from near and far. This special place, however, has been a growing ecological and public health catastrophe for decades, and the Sierra Club has spent many years devoted to addressing this crisis. That's why today's webinar is hosted by our national staff, our Sierra Club California team in Sacramento, and our San Gorgonio and San Diego chapters. So all levels of the Sierra Club are mobilized around the Salton Sea because we will learn today this is not just a issue of regional significance, but of statewide as well. So I want to particularly thank leaders from the San Gorgonio chapter, John Pick and Kim Floyd, who have been a part of leading today's presentation, as well as Joan Taylor and Marianne Ruiz, Danya De Ramon, Brandon Dawson, and Kate Wartek from our team. Today we are here, next slide, please. So as you can see from this, today we are here to give you a robust overview of what's happening at the Salton Sea, as well as take a deeper dive into the issues that you see listed here on the screen today. So this is our roadmap. We are very fortunate to do this work alongside a range of amazing partners and appreciate that they're here with us today to offer their knowledge, experiences, and share more about their important work to save the Salton Sea. So as you can see at the end of the hour, we're going to have some time for a Q&A session with all of our presenters. And one last note, we consider today's talk a Salton Sea 101, and in the future we hope to host more webinars that will peel away even more layers of complexity around what's happening at the sea. And we particularly want to ensure that conversations about the Salton Sea center the voices and experiences of communities living near the sea who are most impacted by the unfolding public health crisis, and center their visions and priorities that they'd like to see for the region's future. So we really hope that you'll stay tuned for future events and hope that you'll join us. Really quick note, next slide, please. Just on the tech components of today. So please make sure that you're connected with the right audio settings to choose your audio connection, and please make sure that you're muted. Also for questions, feel free to populate the chat where we have highlighted here with your questions throughout the presentation. We'll be collecting them for the Q&A section. So feel free to pop those in the chat throughout the presentation. And if you're having any problems at all connecting to the audio, you can listen in. Here's a phone number and webinar ID for that. All right, next slide, please. So let's kick things off, shall we? Our first presenter today is Danya de Ramon, who will give us a brief overview of the history and current issues at the Salton Sea. Danya works with the Sierra Club San Gorgonio chapter, which covers all of San Bernardino and Riverside counties, and where many of our local Salton Sea activists are members. They are a digital and social media assistant for the San Gorgonio chapter and an incoming third-year student at UC Santa Barbara studying communications and art history. So Danya, I'd love to hand it over to you now to kind of give us the stage setting for the rest of the presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Hi, everyone. Brandon, can I get the next slide, please? Thanks. So this afternoon, we'll be looking at some of the history of the Salton Sea. We'll cover some of the politics, ecological issues, and specifically environmental justice issues surrounding the Salton Sea. Can I get the next slide? We're trying to protect this sunset along with local community members and these birds. Last year, Governor Newsom said of the Salton Sea, hold us accountable to doing more, to doing better. We know how to restore the Salton Sea. It's just a question of leadership and making sure we invest real dollars. Next slide, please. Long before the Salton Sea came into being in 1905, there had been the ancient Lake Kawiya. You can see from this image, it was much larger than the current Salton Sea. The faint white outline in the lake itself shows the current shape and area of the Salton Sea. Ancient Lake Kawiya came and went over geologic time as a result of the wanderings of the Colorado River. When the river changed course, the lake would either fill up or dry up, and it would do this in as little as 50 years. The local Kawiya people depended on this freshwater lake for part of their living. Ancient Lake Kawiya was known to exist as recently as 500 years ago. Next slide. An irrigation canal delivering water from Colorado River to farms in southeastern California burst in 1905, flooding a vast expanse of the ancient Lake Kawiya. This historic photo shows the water still flooding into the basin a year later. Next slide. It took nearly 2 years to redirect the flow of the river, and in the meantime, a portion of the historic lake bed filled, becoming today's Salton Sea. Next slide. The sea, measuring approximately 340 square miles, is a terminal lake, which means that water flows in, but no rivers or streams flow out. All of the blue lines leading into the sea on this map are the streams and rivers that flow into the sea, except for the East Highland Canal that had been used to bring mitigation water to the sea. The many smaller channels carrying runoff from the ag lands are not shown here. Next slide, please. The Salton Sea is shrinking due to less runoff water from ag and the reduction of mitigation water coming from the Colorado River. We see increasing shoreline exposed, and this trend will worsen in the future. This exposed shoreline is known as playa, and it contains toxins that have settled there over the last century from the ag runoff and military activities in the World War II era. Next slide. Currently, there are 15,000 to 20,000 acres of exposed dry playa that becomes toxic dust when the wind blows, creating major health issues, including chronic respiratory problems for the thousands of people who live around the Salton Sea and work in the adjacent farmlands. Next slide. As more playa is created by the further shrinking of the Salton Sea, more toxic dust will be produced. Eventually, this will affect the health of the entire Coachella and Imperial Valleys and beyond. And over time, this will include the greater region of Southern California, far beyond the Salton Sea. Next slide. And the degradation of the Salton Sea has become a major disaster for hundreds of species of birds using the Pacific Flyway and for many species of birds that make the Salton Sea their home. Next slide. This slide shows from a bird's eye view the geographic location of the Salton Sea in relation to the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of California. 100 miles with a 3,600-foot elevation gain to the Pacific Ocean and 160 miles and 250-foot elevation gain to the Gulf of California. Next slide. At the time of the water transfer to San Diego in 2003, the largest ever U.S. rural to urban water transfer, virtually everyone realized that this would severely decrease the ag runoff from Imperial Valley farms needed to sustain the Salton Sea. Next slide. At the time the water transfer agreement was signed in 2003, the state assumed responsibility to solve the forecasted ecological and health impacts of the transfer. To allow time to remedy the forecasted disaster, there was a grace period for the water transfer ramping up over 15 years, 2003 to 2018. We can see a big jump in the water transfer rate in 2018, topping out in 2021 at over 260,000 acres foot per year. Next slide. Unfortunately, during most of that 15 years, the state did little but study the problem, while not engaging the local communities most affected by these drastic changes at the sea. Next slide. In the meantime, tens of thousands of acres of dust-laden playa became exposed, exacerbating health issues for surrounding communities and driving environmental injustice. Next slide. Ongoing evaporation combined with diminished water inflows caused the concentration of salts in the Salton Sea to spike to 50% higher than the ocean, causing the collapse of the once abundant fishery, which supported tourism and many of the fish-eating migratory birds. Then in 2017, at the 11th hour, the state issued its Salton Sea Management Program, or SSMP, and promised to have a sustaining long-term plan ready by 2022. Next slide. Now going on 4 years later, the state's plan is still plagued by delays, and very little on the groundwork has been done except a mere 755 acres that have been plowed to slow the dust from blowing, which was completed by the end of 2020. Millions of dollars have been allocated, but progress has been stalled by engineering, staffing, permitting, land ownership, and easement problems. Exactly the kind of problems that the 15-year grace period for the water transfer was intended to solve. The state is committed to completing 29,800 acres of projects to cover exposed playa by 2029. However, the state has failed to hit project goals every year for acreage coverage since the SSMP was adopted in 2017. Next slide, please. Fortunately, the major land easement impasse between the state and Imperial Irrigation District that was stemming projects at the south end of the Salton Sea has been addressed and sorted out with the help of Governor Newsom. Next slide. Construction of one large project commenced earlier this year, which will cover approximately 4,110 acres. This project, located at the south end of the sea and fed by the New River, is named the Species Conservation Habitat. Next slide. This area will be a series of mostly shallow ponds to quell dust and provide wading habitat for many thousands of shorebirds. Next slide. At the north end of the Salton Sea, where underserved communities live closest to the shore and are most subject to its health threats, another major project is proposed. Next slide. This project is the North Lake, to be fed by runoff from the Whitewater River Channel. This will be a multi-benefit project, not only quelling dust, but also sustaining a robust fishery for migrating birds and a recreational and economic driver for the surrounding communities. The North Lake project is currently in engineering phase. Next slide. In addition to efforts in these projects, there are other important activities at play this year, including right now, the state is undertaking a major planning effort that will inform how almost 30,000 acres of projects of the SSMP will be built in the coming years. We need to ensure that these projects, 1, meaningfully engage local communities in the design process, 2, deliver much needed community investments and benefits for people living directly around the sea, 3, ensure that there is proper habitat for wildlife, and 4, prioritize projects where there are most urgent public health impacts happening. The state has a deadline of completing a long-range plan for the Salton Sea by the end of 2022, and this plan will determine the next phase of projects beyond the completion of the SSMP. This planning will be kicking off later this year. Additionally, the state is also currently reviewing proposals for importing water into the Salton Sea. This idea, while promising to some, has many significant challenges that include, but are not limited to, logistics, financing, and energy consumption. This review process has been long awaited and will work to determine if such proposals are feasible. Congressman Raul Ruiz also announced new legislation, the Salton Sea Projects Improvement Acts, to streamline federal help at the Salton Sea, which would authorize $250 million in additional funding. And lastly, an additional $220 million for the Salton Sea is currently being negotiated between the governor's office and the state legislature as part of a climate resilience package. And that's it from me.
Great. That was a ton of info already. Thank you so much, Danya. I really appreciate the overview. So next, as our slide shares, we're going to do a deeper dive on the topic of air quality. And we have Dr. William Porter, who is an assistant professor of atmospheric dynamics and modeling at UC Riverside's Department of Environmental Science. And he will tell us more about air quality issues at the Salton Sea. Please take it away, Dr. Porter.
Thank you. Just to confirm that everybody can hear me okay? Mic working all right? All right, excellent. Afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. As introduced, my name is Will Porter. I'm a professor at UC Riverside. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about this topic, which I think is a really important one. I'm an atmospheric physicist by training, and I've been using tools to examine the emissions, the transport, exposures of different types of pollution in different areas for most of my academic career. And since moving to California, I've been very interested and involved in the kind of work around the Salton Sea that would be relevant to the communities in the area. I think that it's a really important and pressing issue. I think that it is an opportunity for us to practice environmental justice and environmental health skills and tool sets that will be of benefit all over the country and the world, because I think that these are kinds of issues that are going to be only increasing in the coming years. Of course, we've seen a little intro of the Salton Sea, where it is in relation to all of us on the map. And one thing that we know, being where it is, the Salton Sea region is very dusty. And so when we're talking about key pollutants and key types of metrics that we're going to be looking at, PM10, which I'll mention and describe in just a moment here, meaning larger size particles of dust, are very elevated. We can see this is a map of looking at counties that were designated non-attainment, which is an EPA term for basically meaning they did not achieve their pollution goals for this contaminant, for PM10, which is dust. And we can see that right in that area, yes, indeed, that both counties that the Salton Sea straddles were deemed serious in terms of non-attainment for PM10. So there's lots of desert surfaces around. We know it's a dusty place. This is going to impact human health. And we know also that the region is characterized by these periodic dust storms, these large events where we have tons of dust flying through, impacting people's health and lives. We also know, just again, it's a basic mass balance with physics, that when you reduce the inflows, as is happening with the Salton Sea, that we're expected to reduce the water levels. There's going to be a shift in the balance between the evaporation on the sea and the inflow of water coming in. And it's expected to have this period of change that we're in right now. We're seeing this begin to occur with sea levels beginning to drop. That's going to mean that salinity is going to increase. That's going to mean that exposed surface areas that are potentially emissive are going to increase. And it's going to mean that the footprint of this sea over time, as in the current trajectory that we're heading for, is going to look very, very different than it looks today. And so some questions that come up here is, what are going to be the air quality implications of this? More exposed lake bed means more emissive surfaces. No matter how emissive any particular playa or desert surface may be, it's going to be many, many times more emissive than water, which is going to be essentially zero in terms of the particulates that we're looking at there. And it means that everything is going to become more concentrated. The water is going to be more concentrated with all different types of constituents that are currently and will be in there in the future. And then we're also going to be exposing more and more concentrated surface areas as well, because many of those contaminants that were discussed in that previous section tend to sink and they tend to go down. So as we see that footprint shrink, it also means that the concentrations of contaminants in the exposed playa around are going to be increasing. In other words, these are going to be issues, whatever issues they may be, that only become exacerbated with reduced water inflows and water levels. So a quick overview of what we're talking about when we're thinking about particulates. Oftentimes, we tend to characterize particulates by size. So PM10, I've already mentioned this before, is one of the larger size bins, which even though we say large, is still pretty small. We're talking about 10 microns or less, 10 micrometers or less in diameter, which in terms of diameter is about a fifth or so of the diameter of a human hair, which is already, of course, pretty small, and which is itself going to be smaller than what we think about as kind of like fine beach sand. So if you think about fine beach sand like you have on a nice soft beach, we're talking about more in the range of 90 microns. Human hair is going to be less than that. And then PM10 will be even less than that. PM 2.5 is another category that comes up, which is going to be, a fourth the maximum threshold for PM10. So that's even smaller types of particles. And then below that, we even have smaller particle sizes, PM1, that would be the very, very smallest compounds. And just as a quick truism, all particles are best kept out of the lungs in general, right? We don't like to have particulates in the lungs. And so in a sense, no matter what it's made of, all particulates can be toxic, and indeed are if they get into our lungs. PM10 is generally characterized, our mouth and our throat are pretty good at filtering out PM10, but that doesn't mean that they don't have impacts. It's not good in most cases to ingest a lot of the kinds of things that are coming in with that dust. PM 2.5 is the size where it can penetrate down into the lungs. And the smaller and smaller the particle, the more effective it's going to be at bypassing our defenses and getting into our bodies. So this is just a general overview of kind of what we're talking about when we're looking at PM10, PM 2.5, PM1. But something else that we know is that not all particles are going to be equal. Different compositions, what the particle is made of, may have very different health effects. And this is very new types of knowledge for us. In the past, we didn't really have the tech to really parse out a lot of the particulates, certainly not at many, many locations, of what the composition of the dust is. In an area like the Salton Sea, we believe it's very important. And I'll present some research in just a moment here that suggests that this may be true. So in the Salton Sea, this is from a study that was conducted by Emma Aronson, Mia Maltz, Eric Peng, David Cocker at UCR. They noticed that the composition of particulates around the sea, so we have one area at the Dos Palmas Reserve, very close to the sea, we see in green a high fraction of organics, which is much, much less when we looked further away from the sea at this other site they were studying here. And so the composition of the particles is going to vary by source. And differences are observed both in the elemental composition and the abundance of organics. And this is potentially important. The causes and the consequences of those differences are still currently under examination. And I'll mention as a disclaimer that many of the things that I'm going to be presenting here today, as a quick snapshot, we're going to fly through, are still in progress. So the question that we're going into this with, could increasing levels of these particulates from the shrinking Salton Sea exacerbate health impacts on an already vulnerable population in the area? We know that childhood asthma around the Salton Sea is already very high. It's elevated in some counties, in some locations, around 3 times the incidence rates of the rest of California, exceeding also other regions that are desert type regions. A survey of symptoms among children in Imperial Valley suggests an even higher incidence. And then further north, we don't see these effects to be quite as prominent. We see these asthma rates to not be as elevated. And so the question that we went in here, this group at UCR, was to try and answer this question. Does Salton Sea particulate exposure play a role in these kinds of health disparities? And what can be expected in the future? So some of the work I'm going to be showing here is conducted by Dr. David Lowe's group, who was instrumental in securing some funding for us to conduct this research. He put together a team that secured some NIH funding that was focused on these very questions, looking at health in the region, looking at particulates. Long-term air quality measurements, of which we have a handful across the area, can give us insights into the patterns, diurnal and seasonal patterns that we see. This is just a quick look at the seasonal and diurnal patterns that we see for dust in the area. These are these stations. I've noted them on the left, these stations that we have long-term measurements. We see on the right, spring, summer, fall, and winter. And then across the x-axis, going across here, these are the diurnal trends. So we can see that the spring and summer seasons in particular, we see these elevated concentrations of this dust in that late afternoon, early evening period. So this was kind of the first way that I was investigating what are the patterns of these dust events, where do we see this dust exposure happening? And then we also see this variability occur in terms of direction. This is also going to be important. It's not a consistent direction year round. We see these swings in the dominant wind direction, and this is going to mean it's going to have implications for where the dust is coming from as a function of which month you're breathing that air in. And we see that indeed, this is for the site at Torres Martinez, that we do see high dust concentrations, as shown by these red colors here, coming from that southwest direction, especially in these summer months. And so this type of information going into this was what led me to ask this question about, could the wind direction, could the composition of the dust that's being inhaled, could that be having impacts on the people in the communities? One of the ways that we've been trying to understand that composition was by putting up these dust collection towers that you can see here, which are basically just bunt pans filled with marbles to maximize the collection surface area, as well as skimming contaminants out of the water and using those. we put those into mouse chambers. So we looked at a mouse model as kind of an example of what might happen to humans. And basically just as a rough initial examination, looked at what happened to mouse lungs when they were exposed to particles from different types. Here's a little, just a schematic and then a picture of the kinds of setup that we had in Dr. Lowe's lab to do these kinds of findings. This was just published. This is hot off the press, looking at Salton Sea aerosol exposure in mice and looking at the response in terms of what is happening to these cells as they're exposed to different types of contaminants. So when mice were exposed to a known allergen, no surprise, we saw this allergic inflammation. Mice exposed to Salton seawater particulates, these are particulates kind of harvested from the Salton Sea water. There was inflammation, but it was non-allergic, which is important in terms of what types of treatments might be most effective. So it was kind of a unique type of inflammation, which was not present when water from the Pacific Ocean was used to expose to these mouse lungs. So what was found in this result, or in this particular study, was a non-allergic inflammation, but an inflammation nonetheless that was unique and could compound with already inflamed tissues from other types of sources. So this means that we could be seeing a compounding effect from whatever compounds are causing this response in the Salton seawater, along with what else, other things that might be influencing lung tissues. In my group, we're also looking at health outcomes from surveys, from hospitalizations in the region, to fly, and I'm going to kind of fly through these slides. I want to just make another quick plug that I'm happy to follow up afterwards with any questions about any of these research results. But we've been looking at hospitalizations, survey outcomes, looking at differences in those two types of health outcomes to see if more can be learned about the timing, the exposure, and the source of pollutants that might be causing them. And then so some key takeaways. I know this was a very quick sampler plate of some of the research that we're doing centered at UCR, but some of the key takeaways that we've been finding and that I just want to make sure we walk away with are that the particle emissions and transport across the Salton Sea Basin has both seasonal and diurnal cycles. It's not uniform over time. And this means that these influences on human health themselves may have these distinct cycles and patterns. Exposure to particles originating from the Salton Sea, this is unique to the Salton Sea water, appears to induce a unique and non-allergic lung inflammation, which has ramifications for the ways that we might mitigate and treat it. This implies that a standard kind of asthma treatment of giving an inhaler, for example, to reduce that allergic reaction, which is typical of most asthma attacks and the ways that we treat it, may not be the best way to stage an intervention on these kinds of responses that we're seeing in the Salton Sea. What that best way is remains open. Certainly, it's going to imply that if this is caused by contaminants in the region, minimizing those exposures, either through mitigation of kinds of emissions from the playa or from areas around it, or from changing the ways that we communicate risk and communicate when these events are going to occur, may be helpful. We've got additional dust collection and analysis underway in collaboration with local community groups. And then I'll make a plug for more information from the Breathe Center, from this Health Disparity Center at UCR. And of course, my email address is here, wporter@ucr.edu, and I'll be happy to follow up with anyone with questions about the health.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Porter. Quite a lot to cover in the 10 minutes we gave you to do it, but really appreciate how comprehensive and how important the research is. So next, and again, just a reminder to folks to please, as Marianne has indicated in the chat, you can send Marianne Ruiz your questions in the chat as we're going through. We'll be collecting those and we'll bring them to the Q&A. Okay, next up we have, can we get the slides, Brandon? Great. Thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Ryan Sinclair. He is an associate professor of environmental microbiology in the Loma Linda University School of Public Health. His current projects evaluate human exposure to pathogens in surface water, wastewater, and in drinking water. And I'll hand it over to him to talk about issues around water quality at the Salton Sea.
All right, hi everybody. Again, I'm Ryan Sinclair. I work at the Loma Linda University School of Public Health, and I've been working in the Eastern Coachella Valley for a while, for 5 years or so, on different projects and with different community partners. On this presentation, I want to talk to you about water quality in the Salton Sea and kind of like how to get access to some of this water quality, and how to kind of understand what's going on with the Salton Sea in terms of a water quality perspective. So I also talked to you about community science and what that is, and how we can start collecting data together. So next slide. All right, well, I just have put this slide together to kind of summarize the different kinds of water quality contaminants. So you'll have a couple of different water quality contaminants. You have natural compounds, and those are going to be things that are kind of coming out of the Salton Sea, and they're just they're there anyway. You have the odor, you have algae and associated toxins. You also have maybe I put blight, but the sort of things that happen in the Salton Sea, like an increased amount of playa and desert around the Salton Sea. And then a lot of uncertainties and unknowns. There's a lot of groups out there working on different contaminants that might be in the Salton Sea and in the sea spray that might have a health impact on communities and ecology around the Salton Sea. So those are kind of that natural group. Then there's the anthropogenic compounds and contaminants, and those definitely have some ecological and human health impacts. And that would be pesticides, fecal indicators, nutrients. So with this one, you know, there's a variety of pesticides out there. Fecal indicators is like Enterococcus, E. coli, and they indicate that there's human or animal fecal pollution in the lake, and that's kind of the one that gets you away from having the swimmability and recreational standards. And then nutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients that can help plants grow. But if you have too many nutrients, they cause a lake to go into a state called eutrophication, which means that it's has an excess amount of nutrients and less dissolved oxygen. Anyhow, those are kind of my contaminant list there in broad general categories. But I wanted to go to the next slide and talk about what this Salton Sea current status is. We made up this map here to kind of show Southern California and how many water bodies are there that are actually considered impaired water bodies. And there's a lot. Salton Sea is a big one, of course. It stands out because it's so big, and all the ag canals and drainage canals underneath the Salton Sea, or the south of the Salton Sea. But, you know, something to take into mind is that Salton Sea, it has a bad rap and a bad reputation, and I want to also think with you about that. And is it a fair portrayal of the Salton Sea to have this sort of media frenzy about how it is contaminated and toxic and all of these words that people use about it? Well, certainly there are a lot of contaminants in it and a lot of issues coming up, and it's a major issue and environmental catastrophe that's happening. But think about it, it is still considered an impaired water body, but think about it in comparison to another lake. Think about Big Bear Lake. That one is also an impaired water body. It's not only one contaminant, it's several contaminants there. The only major difference is in terms of contaminants and in terms of this perspective from the water quality boards and the EPA who make this impaired water body 303D list. The only difference is really the Enterococcus, the bacteria, and that impacts the swimmability. The big thing, the perception you have in your mind about Big Bear Lake is boats and people recreating, expensive houses on the shoreline, completely opposite from the Salton Sea. It's not exactly a fair comparison, but it does illustrate the point that the Salton Sea is impaired, but, you know, we have the chance to improve it just as much as we do with Big Bear Lake. Anyway, go to the next slide. So I wanted to go through and kind of review some of the different different contaminants that we know about in the Salton Sea. There's definitely uncertainties there. There's agencies responsible for reporting different classes of contaminants. But in looking through the literature over the last several years and looking at what's available out there, there's big gaps in what we know. Some of the better studies I found about pesticides were published in the 2000 to 2010 era. And there was a couple of them from the USGS and affiliated scientists down in the southern part of the Salton Sea in the tributaries, the New River and the Alamo River. And in 2008 to 2009, it was confirmed that there's, you know, several pesticides out there in those rivers, both current pesticides of current use and also pesticides that are legacy pesticides. So these are legacy organochlorine, organophosphate pesticides, and their degradates like DDT and their degradates DDD and DDE. And those are some of the things that have hit the Salton Sea to put it on this this impaired water body list. Go to the next slide. So that's the sample locations for those studies in the south. Really, there's not a lot of information known about pesticides in the Salton Sea, so we have to look at their tributaries. Okay, go to the next one. This next one is the some studies that I found. I kind of searched pretty hard to look for pesticides data about the Salton Sea and the tributaries. And there's really one major one and several minor agricultural canals going into the Salton Sea. And the major one is the Whitewater River. And the Whitewater River is studied for pesticides as well. But in the studies that I was able to find, chlorpyrifos was the only one that was even above the lowest observed adverse effect level. That's a term that just means it's the term where at that level, there's not going to be any harm to humans or animals. Lowest observed adverse effect level. So all of the chlorpyrifos were less than that number in all of those sites, and there was no other pesticides reported there. And that was just done recently in the Colorado River Regional Water Board in association with this agricultural coalition. So anyway, go to the next slide. What we do know about the Salton Sea and what Dr. Porter just reported on as well is this salinity. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife has several sample points around where they're able to look at salinity. And they've been doing this reliably from 2000 to 2020 and 21. And we are able to see now we're in that exponential curve up with the increasing amount of playa and increasing amount of salinity there. So in the last few years, the salinity in the middle of the lake has gone up. And those bars on the bottom, of course, those are the rivers, the inputs. Those don't change because those are rivers, freshwater rivers. So the salinity there isn't changing. So go to the next slide. And just one little point I wanted to talk about here was that the Alamo River and the New River are flowing into the Salton Sea from the south, and the Whitewater River is flowing in from the north. And the blue line on the bottom is the total amount of water going in, the daily discharge in cubic feet per second. And that's the Whitewater River on the bottom. The other two are the New River and Alamo Rivers. And those have a lot more flow into the Salton Sea. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that I also looked at the same data set for total nitrogen and Tkn, which is another measurement of nitrogen going in. The interesting thing here is that, that uncertainty I just talked to you about pesticides for the north. The north also has an uncertainty about nutrients. We don't have any information about nutrients going into the Salton Sea. So there's this huge gap in data there. But what I saw that was really interesting was that the Whitewater River, for what is reported in the Whitewater River, total nitrogen is almost double or sometimes more than double of what the Alamo and New River is. However, because of the flow, the total amount of nitrogen going into the Salton Sea is greater at the south end, but the concentration of what's in the Whitewater River is actually much higher in the Whitewater River. And we don't know anything about these ag canals that run into the Salton Sea as well, but this is definitely something to consider. The next slide shows you a recent UCR study with some of Dr. Porter's colleagues at with Carolyn and the Lions Biogeochemistry group. They actually were able to look at this H2s upwelling. So we all know that the smell, the hydrogen sulfide, comes out of the Salton Sea, and that's what is kind of infamous about the Salton Sea. Well, in the summertime, and actually right now, I've been getting these alerts all day and yesterday and the day before about H2s emissions. There's this thing going on where the bottom of the lake becomes anoxic and sulfidic, and that's in the deeper northern section. And then these upwellings of H2s happen, and that causes a green tide event or a gypsum bloom. And that's a kind of a unique phenomenon that's in the Salton Sea that we're just starting to understand. It was just described a few years ago. And it's kind of a neat thing about the Salton Sea, but also something that's one of these natural contaminants that we don't know much about, but their group at UCR is looking into that. Anyway, so keep going. So the total inputs to the Salton Sea, we know that there's nitrogen going in from the rivers. We know that salinity is increasing, and we know that the flow from the rivers isn't really decreasing, but the flow from the ag canals is. So those are some things that we know, but there's a lot more on the next slide about what we don't know. And that is all of these natural compounds, this H2s, the selenium, the gypsum blooms, green tide events. We're still really trying to understand what's going on there. What we do know about is that there's this high Enterococcus bacterial indicator. I've done that in the lab here too, and we've always found it to be really high wherever we sample. I'm not quite sure why that's high, but there's still a lot of uncertainty there as well. So my overall message is there's a lot of uncertainty in the water quality data. Now I'm going to transition to maybe just a few more slides on the balloon mapping and our community science. This is what we did before. Our community science group now is focused on water quality, but just the last few years we've been doing this thing on balloon mapping. So if you can just play that video, see if it plays. So I'm just going to talk through this video. It's a YouTube video where we did satellite images and then balloon mapping with the community to kind of show the shoreline change at the North Shore Yacht Club. So this is an area that's familiar to everybody, so we decided to go there. This should say 2003 to 2017 for the QSA. And that was that 15 years that Dania was talking about earlier. And over that 15 years, you can see that the shoreline's increasing, and over that 15 years, and then by 2017 it ends, and that's 6 to 20 feet in 15 years. But then we did some balloon mapping after that in 2018, 19, and 2021, and we saw that the shoreline changed by 348 feet in 3 years versus 620 feet in 15 years. So in the last few years, it's really started to take this exponential shift up. And so that really impacts, you can go to the next slide or go back to the slide, I guess. That really impacts the water quality in the Salton Sea. So we have this community science program now, and I wanted to kind of plug that. We're trying to get participants that live around the Salton Sea that want to participate in this. And you know, the idea behind community science is really to do science together with the community, and if you can go to the next slide, and kind of address things with them and let the community be the one that outlines the priorities. And you know, I'm an environmental microbiologist, and I'd be studying Enterococcus and the microbiome and everything. But because of the community is there, they're really wanting to highlight the pesticide issue. So that's why I've been kind of focusing on that and some of the other things. But really the advocacy needs for us is to kind of have two things with community science, is to train up people in skills and knowledge, and also to get data out there. So, and the main thing for training them up and having data out there is to coordinate a best practices dashboard, and to make something where people can look and find out water quality information about the Salton Sea and respond to all of this uncertainty that's out there regarding contaminants and pollutants that are going in and coming out of the Salton Sea. I have a couple more slides, but I'll cut it off for now and in consideration for time. I put my email here, and also I put Will Porter's on there because he's been collaborating as well. So that's it for now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ryan, and thanks for being cognizant of time. We are going, I'll just flag that we are going a little bit over, but it's really great to see like steady number of participants that we have here. So I will just flag now for folks to consider, maybe we can stay on a little bit longer if folks have the availability to like do a little bit more of a Q&A, just so we make sure to answer some questions. But this is a ton of great content. Thank you so much, Dr. Sinclair. Okay, so next I would love to pass this over to Andrea Jones, who is the Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon, California. And for the past 14 years, she has led conservation programs and worked with staff and the network of Audubon chapters across the state to implement conservation projects. And she will be talking about ecosystem and habitat health at the Salton Sea today. So now I'm very pleased to hand it over to Andrea.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Well, I'm going to dive right in and talk about what lives above the surface of the Salton Sea. And this is our Salton Sea team. We've been sort of re-engaged recently in the Salton Sea for the past 8 years. We've got 2 staff on the ground, Frank and Camila, and then myself in Southern California and Mike in Sacramento doing policy work. Next slide. And so our work at the Salton Sea I'm going to talk to you about is a combination of spatial analysis work we do on computers and also on the ground field research. And so one of the things that we've done is we've created an online map. It's available on our website for anyone to go in and play with, and we'll put a link up for that. And that gives you ways to look at how much the Salton Sea is being exposed as the years go by and where the exposure occurs, and also who the landowners are and what kind of projects are happening on the ground. So this is just a way to depict, and you can see most of the exposure is happening on the south end of the sea, where it's predicted to be 40,000 acres of exposure by 2023. Next slide. And also, when we first started re-engaging at the Salton Sea, we realized the first thing we needed to do was quantify the amount of habitat that currently exists at the sea for birds and other wildlife, and we focused on birds. And so we looked at data from 1999 and 2015 before things really started to change at the sea. And we quantified almost 58,000 acres of habitat made up of these various buckets of habitat types. And we did a model to identify these habitats, and we presented all of this data to the state. Next slide. And we're also using data from other sources. And one of the kind of simple graphics I wanted to show you was the increase in salinity over time, because that dictates the kind of birds that are able to use the sea. And you can see this is based on data from Bureau of Reclamation that the salinity is approaching 75 parts per thousand, which is just about twice as salty as the ocean. And it's reaching the kind of salinity you would see at Mono Lake or parts of Great Salt Lake. And so that's causing changes in the ecosystem. As the water decreases, the salinity increases. Next slide. And this shows you an example of what happens with that changing salinity. This is a picture going through time of an island called Mullet Island on the south end of the sea, where double-crested cormorants, a fish-eating seabird, nested in a colony of over 5,000 pairs. And that colony had to abandon. As you can see, the island no longer becomes an island and was predated by coyotes, and there's no longer any cormorants nesting at the sea anymore. And at the same time, their food resource also disappeared. So the tilapia, which is the last big fish that these big fish-eating birds can eat, the salinity has gotten too high for them both to survive and also to be able to reproduce. There are a few pockets of freshwater left where there is some tilapia, but by and large, most of the tilapia are gone from the Salton Sea. Next slide. And this is corroborated by data from California Wildlife. And they did aerial surveys over the Salton Sea for 10 years and showed that the fish-eating birds, namely the American white pelican, the brown pelican, and the double-crested cormorant, have really declined to almost nothing. And those are birds that rely on fish. The big hit really is with the white pelican, because about 30% of their whole North American population wintered at the Salton Sea. And we now only see a handful of birds passing through, nothing like the thousands of birds that we used to see at the Salton Sea. Next slide. And so we decided it was time to start doing some surveys and keep track of these changes as they're going on and be able to relay that information to the state, who hasn't had the resources to do comprehensive surveys around the Salton Sea. Next slide. And so Audubon Surveys take up a few different approaches. We've been surveying birds around the sea for 5 years. I'll show you a map of where we survey. 3 years ago, we added water quality surveys at our bird survey points. In the last 2 years, we've also been collecting invertebrates, and the Bureau of Reclamation is helping us with that analysis. Audubon's also been doing Christmas bird counts at the Salton Sea since the 1950s, so we have that information available to us. Plus Oasis Bird Observatory, which is a professional volunteer group. They've been doing weekly bird surveys at the north end of the sea. They share their information with us. And also Point Blue Conservation Science hosts an annual shorebird survey that they've been doing for the past 10 or so years of the entire shoreline, or almost the entire shoreline. We do our surveys with local high school kids through a program we call Eyes on the Sea that Frank Ruiz manages. And we also employ interns every year, locally based interns, to help us do our survey work, as well as volunteers. Next slide. Here's another picture of the students collecting the data. We think it's really important to provide this opportunity for students to see the sea and participate in research. Next slide. And so here's some very basic data analysis. On the left, map shows our survey point locations. which don't cover every bit of the sea, but they're places that we felt we could do repeatable surveys because they were accessible at the time. And you'll see our most abundant species are gulls, ruddy ducks, northern shovelers, and small sandpipers called western and least sandpipers. And the sandpipers are coming down from the Arctic, and they're usually just coming through the Salton Sea in spring and fall migration, but they come through in very large numbers. And here's the total number of birds counted in the last 5 years. And there's been a slight decline, but the decline we're seeing in the total number of birds is not statistically significant. But what we are seeing is a shift in the kinds of birds that are able to use the Salton Sea. Next slide. So we've seen a statistically significant decline in birds higher on the food chain, as in the fish-eating birds, down to very few to almost none. The story is a little bit different with eared grebe. That is a bird that relied on eating pileworms, and they come to Salton Sea in late winter. Historically, they counted up to 2 million eared grebes at the Salton Sea in late winter. These declined in the last 5 years to almost, a handful of 100 birds. We've seen an uptick in birds in this past year, and I'll show you a slide as to why that piece of good news happened. Next slide. What we are seeing is stable or increasing populations of shorebirds and some of the dabbling ducks, and those are ducks that are feeding in the mud on invertebrates like shovelers and ruddy ducks. And so these birds are doing well at the sea, and this is just 3 years of data, and we're in the process of analyzing now a 5-year data set, but we're seeing the same results, that the shorebirds are still doing really well, and we're holding on to those numbers of shorebirds and ducks at the sea. Next slide. Now, this is from Bob McKern at Oasis Bird Observatory. He started to see an increase of eared grebes out on the sea surface, and he thought it was associated with a hatch of water boatman, which is an aquatic insect that has really exploded at the sea as we've seen a loss of fish species. And the eared grebes, as well as just about everything else at the sea, eats the water boatman. And so he's seeing this return of almost 500,000 eared grebes in the late winter. So that's really good news. It's a little disturbing that they're eating one thing mostly, and so we're going to have to track that really closely. Next slide. And so our summary results are, salinity's increased by 66%. It's more than twice as salty as the ocean. We're still working on this data, but dissolved oxygen appears to be declining, which will have an effect on aquatic species, some of the invertebrates that the birds are relying on. 90% of our soil samples along our 14 survey points are water boatmen. That's good news for water boatmen, I guess, but if conditions become inhospitable for water boatmen, we don't know what's next, what these birds would eat. At other saline lakes, there's brine shrimp, which we don't have at the Salton Sea. And so a loss of these water boatmen could potentially cause a collapse of the ecosystem. But for now, there's a lot of birds feeding on the water boatmen. Species diversity has changed at the site level, which means we're seeing a shift in which birds can use which areas. Birds are mostly concentrating on the freshest pieces of water they can find at the mouths of the rivers and at the mouths of some of the canals. And we're also seeing a lot of wetland habitat, and I'll explain more about that in just a moment. Next slide. And about wetlands, so we had been hearing a lot of wetlands were emerging at the sea as we're seeing canals no longer reach the sea, and that water is spreading out on the dry playa. And those canals are creating wetlands basically at the mouth of them, and they're new bodies of wetlands. And so we started mapping them using aerial imagery, and we quantified 6,000 acres of these freshwater wetlands. And these are incredible resources for birds. They're full of rails, pupfish, shorebirds. This information is all on our website, by the way. You can download this information, and we're happy to provide these maps. Next slide. And you can zoom in and see where exactly these wetlands are. We're providing this information to the state to try and convince them to use the wetlands to build habitats and not build over them or ignore them so that they dry up. They're a really great resource that can help the state with their habitat restoration projects, and they're filled with birds. Next slide. One of these sites that Audubon is focusing on is the Bombay Beach wetlands, just south of the town of Bombay Beach. And that's a wetland that's actually fed by freshwater springs, but it serves the same purpose. It's being exposed as the sea recedes, filled with birds. And we're working on a project to try and expand that wetland to put more of the water on the dry playa, and that will eliminate dust issues in that region and also create access opportunities for people to visit that area. Next slide. And last but not least, I just wanted to make a plug, since Sierra Club people like to go to the Salton Sea and go birding. We have an online birding trail map on our website, and it provides you with an opportunity to identify places that you can actually access the sea and go birding. And if you click on this map, you'll be able to see what kinds of birds you might be able to see at each site. And we're constantly updating this as the sea changes so that these locations will continue to be accessible for bird watching and recreation. Thank you. I think that's my last slide. Here's some contact information. I'd love to thank all the volunteers and staff and state and federal employees that have helped us with our projects.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea, for your presentation. I'm going to move us right along to our second to last presenter. We have Miguel Hernandez from Comité Cívico del Valle. He is the communications coordinator there. Miguel is a community advocate for the Salton Sea and water-related concerns in the Salton Sea region. He is serving in different programs within the organization, as well as being part of different committees for water and the Salton Sea. As a bilingual advocate serving the community of the Salton Sea region, he understands the importance of language barriers, cultural context, and the benefit of incorporating a graphic aspect into engaging meaningful participation from community residents. Welcome, Miguel. Thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
Thank you, Jenny. And as presenter, my name is Miguel Hernandez with Comité Cívico. There's my contact information. I'd like to start with that. We're a nonprofit based in Raleigh. However, we work throughout the state, and I myself more specifically in the Salton Sea region. And today I'm here to talk about environmental justice and community participation regarding the Salton Sea. We have the Salton Sea Community Engagement Program, the Salton Sea COEE program, which has these three main objectives: to outreach, educate, and engage community into the Salton Sea. This is part of the environmental justice principles to not only educate the community, but more so doing it in a way that it's meaningful, that it takes the importance of bringing, cultural context, and in the way that it resonates into our community's minds and hearts. So this is the intention of this program. The Salton Sea COEE program is being delivered in partnership with the Department of Water Resources, directly with the state. So we are overseen by them. All the information goes through them for veracity and having good factual checks on our materials. So like I said, we worked on this particular program throughout the region of the East Coachella Valley, and even at times across the border, the southern border of California, in the Mexicali area. So hit next slide, please. So one of the ways that we approach, or one of the strategies that we have to reach our community, we use traditional media as well as more modern media, social media and videos. And this is one of the current PSAs that we have. We've had about 4 PSAs running. This is the most current one. If you want to hit play on that, please.
The Salton Sea is shrinking rapidly, but working together, we can improve this situation. The state's Salton Sea Management Program is moving forward with projects to reduce the exposed lake bed and restore habitat. This is your opportunity to participate in the future of Salton Sea. Get informed and get involved by visiting www.saltonseacoee.org and the state's website at saltonsea.ca.gov. Together for the Salton Sea.
Okay, so this is, like I said, the most current PSA that we have airing right now, and this is aired throughout the region. So for those of you that live nearby or in the Salton Sea region, most likely you have seen this, or hopefully you have seen this PSA on TV or radio. And there is a series of videos that we are developing to bring awareness. This particular message was in regards to the overall Salton Sea management program, that there is a program plan that was developed by the state, and encourage people to visit our website and of course the state's website to learn more about the Salton Sea. Next slide, please.
The Salton Sea is shrinking.
Another way of us engaging with the community, and this more reaching a younger audience. We do school presentations with a similar content of so this workshop, but much smaller, to educate our youth, educate students about overall information on the Salton Sea, promote awareness on what's going on, what could potentially happen in the Salton Sea, what the importance of air quality should be for them and their family, and of course give an overall perspective or knowledge on the Salton Sea management plan. Next slide, please. We also go to community fairs. This program is highly based on one-on-one interactions, just like the school presentations. We'll also go to community fairs. Prior to COVID, we will at least go like 5 or 6 a month. Now that this situation is coming back to some sort of normality, we're doing sort of hybrid workshops, in person and digital, and to the extent possible, we're having our table set up where we have these communications with community members to let them know what's going on. We have our educational materials, which you will be seeing next, and engage in conversation as of why they should be informed about the Salton Sea, why they should be aware of what's going on, and of course, open up opportunities for them to participate and be part of the conversation. The state has opened up opportunities for public input, and we want to make sure that community members are being part of this conversation. So having these interactions on a one-to-one basis has really opened up to have a meaningful understanding of what the sense of our community is. There has been cases where when we did our program, or we did a presentation, let's say 2019 or so, and then 2021, we get to see those same community members, and they asked us, what's going on? What happened since last time? We try to, I think us of the presentation in regards to the progress that has happened at the Salton Sea. We try to, uplift the current efforts that are happening, such as the Species Conservation Habitat Project. And we try to have or keep that engagement from our community. Sometimes it gets a little bit difficult. There's either slow progress at the sea, but we try to make a way to have them be part of this conversation, have them join these meetings, especially when there is, the state is seeking out for public input. Next slide, please. It's just another slide of these community events that we go out. As you see, it's at schools, community centers. So anywhere that we get a chance to host or be part of this community meetings, we try to be there, and it's, to the extent possible, get this information in the community. This is a sample with just the front covers of our materials. What you see on your left is the Salton Sea informational booklet, which contains a little bit of everything per se. It has a slide on air quality, and a slide on the Salton Sea management plan, slide on birds, just to get that initial one-on-one education to our community. Of course, it opens up for them to learn more if they want to learn a little bit more about what's going on, and connect with state, of course with Comité Cívico. And what you see on your right, the 12 facts about the Salton Sea, It's pretty much, you know, a really condensed 12 facts of the Salton Sea, talking about the what's going on, the recedings of the sea, the acreage of playa that will be exposed, the impact to human health, to habitat, birds, fish, also the particulate matter that could potentially reach our lungs, and also present about the 10-year plan. Really 3 points, quick points about the 10-year plan, and of course open up again for engagement and invite the community to be part of these conversations and be part of these meetings. Next slide, please. Another way, we have our website. We try to keep it as current as we can. We're actually working on it, on keeping it current. And as you saw on the PSA, our website is saltonseacoee.org. And we have this pretty much what's in the booklet, in the educational booklet. You'll find it on this website, along another sort of portion of our program, which is the School Track program, which relates to the air quality, and it's an educational program that helps have a visual, a color, a flag, for students to know what the current quality is. So you'll find that there as well, as it is part of this program. I invite you to check it out, and if you actually wanted to go to the website, if you click on check air quality here, it will redirect you to Comite's air monitoring network, which is the IVAN network, and you could find the real-time data for air quality at different locations around the Salton Sea region. Next slide. Okay, well, that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thanks, Jenny, and everyone at Sierra Club for this space. Thank you all.
Thanks. Thanks so much to you, Miguel, for being here and for sharing more about the important work you're doing. And Marianne, if we could put the link that Miguel shared in the chat, that would be great. Thanks so much for your time. All right, we got one last presenter, and then we're gonna dip a little bit over, if that's okay with folks. I really just wanna make sure we can do our Q&A after our last presenter, who is Joan Taylor, our very own Joan Taylor. Joan has been a desert activist with many conservation organizations for over 50 years, which is amazing, and currently serves as vice chair of Sierra Club's California Nevada Desert Committee. And she's going to give us a very brief run through of water politics at the Salton Sea. Super, super easy topic, right?
Yeah, hopefully interesting. So please put up the slides. Mark Twain got it right when he said, water is for fighting over. Nowhere is this truer than the Colorado River. Here's a brief overview of the interplay between the Colorado and the Salton Sea. Next slide. In 1922, Colorado water was originally divided between upper and lower basins and allocated to water districts in portions of 7 states, to many Indian tribes, and to Mexico. Next slide. For millennia, as you've heard, the Salton Sea had kind of an intimate relationship with the Colorado. Because it lies 240 feet below sea level, see the dark purple that merges into black, the Salton Sea was often the alternate outlet to the Colorado, since water follows gravity and the course of least resistance. That's because over time, the muddy Colorado would actually silt up its path to the Gulf of California, turn west and north, sucked by gravity into the Salton Trough. Then over time, its Imperial Valley Delta would silt over and the river would meander back to the Gulf, then repeat. This repeated meander made the Imperial Valley, next slide, soils extremely rich. And while the Central Valley seems to get all the press, 2/3 of the nation's winter vegetables are grown in the Imperial Valley, where crops grow in 2 or 3 rotations a year, fed by constant sunlight and a very large Colorado River water allocation. Next. Back when the river was allocated in 22, there was plenty of water for ag, as well as for the smaller urban areas served by the Colorado. As you can see from the jagged blue line representing Colorado runoff, it's been trending down. Meanwhile, per the red line, demand for this water has been rising. Why is this? If anything, ag water use in the region is moderated over time. Next. The basic problem is twofold. Over the last century, tens of millions of people have thronged to live in the sunny, dry cities of the Southwest. Even places like San Diego get less than 10 inches a year of rain. Meanwhile, the Colorado has encountered a 20-year drought that isn't likely to get any better with climate change. Next slide. Since 22, big compromises have had to be made. As you can see, they're all smiles here at the signing of the 2003 Quantification Settlement Agreement you heard about earlier, which transferred hundreds of thousands of feet of water to cities by fallowing and farm conservation in Imperial Valley. But the beleaguered birds on the Pacific Flyway and the communities threatened by dust are not smiling. Next slide. The Salton Sea relies on Imperial Valley farm water for 90% of its inflows. And QSA-caused farm conservation has concentrated and reduced runoff to the Salton Sea, exacerbating its hypersalinity and shore exposure problems. Next. Here is Lake Mead, the giant reservoir that meters out allocations for the lower basin states. It's fallen to less than 40% of capacity. So 2 years ago, a revised deal for cutbacks was struck. It's called the Drought Contingency Plan. Next. While this plan was in negotiation, we were all assured that any potential impacts to the Salton Sea arising from its cutbacks were going to be fully mitigated, as is required under law. But when it was introduced into Congress, the language contained a complete waiver of all laws. In other words, screw the Salton Sea. Imperial Irrigation District, Sierra Club, Defenders of Wildlife, and former Senator Boxer spoke out publicly against this waiver. Unfortunately, our electeds intervened and the waiver was removed. Next. But still, there is a lot of money and influence behind the scenes working to sway the outcome of future Colorado River negotiations to serve urban interests. And the Salton Sea is an impediment to their plans. Next. Meanwhile, thanks to state action, as you've heard, the Salton Sea is the last on a slow road to recovery, but its fate rests squarely on having adequate water to sustain the current and long-term efforts to preserve shoreline and fishery habitat, to renew the economic vitality of the region, and to quell dust to protect the health of 650,000 people in its airshed. So we all need to remain vigilant. There will be a gross environmental, economic, and social justice crisis unless we make sure that the next water negotiation will ensure this special place has adequate life-giving water into the future. That's it, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joan. That was an incredibly impressive, succinct summary on a very complex topic. Really appreciate it. So I'm going to flag we're about 10 minutes behind, but we are just going to dive into our Q&A. And we have an incredible amount of great questions that have popped up. And so, oh, thanks, Brandon. Thanks for pinning all of us as speakers up here. Or maybe it's just my face and someone else's face soon. Anyways, we're just going to dive in. Thanks everyone for sticking around. I want to raise a great first question that we got, which is from Jensen Fiskin, who's a student at Palm Desert High School. And Jensen wants to know, what can the public, and I think this is a great question for all panelists, what can the public and more specifically youth and local students do to help restore the Salton Sea and support neighboring communities? Does anyone have some thoughts to offer Jensen they'd like to start off with?
Yeah, I will. This is Andrea with Audubon. I think it would be great for students to participate in our bird surveys. And so you can reach out to me or Frank Ruiz, who lives on the north end of the sea, if you'd like to participate. And then Ryan also mentioned a community science program that he has going, but we're always looking for students to take out with us at the sea to help collect data.
Thank you, Andrea. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, of course, we have our community science program. There's the Audubon, you know, you can work in the South with the Imperial County groups as well. But I think with the Salton Sea, there's also a lot of, you're doing the right thing by attending this webinar. I think that knowing more about the Salton Sea and kind of getting beyond just that general popular media negative impression of the Salton Sea is great. You know, you should understand it as a complicated system. It's an amazing place, has an amazing diversity, amazing history, and just kind of get a good understanding of it. But yes, please reach out to us and see if you can join our groups that are going out to do active work on the Salton Sea.
Anyone else before we move on? Joan?
Well, I would just say register to vote if you haven't already, and keep making noise about the rights of the Salton Sea to have water.
And if I could add real quick, you know, if this is the first time you hear about the Salton Sea, or you know, this is a great opportunity. This webinar, I think, had a little bit of everything, which, you know, sparks that, you know, enthusiasm to get to know more about the Salton Sea. There's a complex topic, which is the Salton Sea. So I encourage you to learn a little bit more. Feel free to reach out to me or to any of our colleagues on the panel if you want to expand a little bit more on our participation and what our work is on Salton Sea.
Great, thanks. All right, got plenty more questions. Any last thoughts on that before we move on? All right, Will, the next question is for you from Chris Cockcroft. He would like to know if you've read the SSMP dust suppression plan, and I suppose this is for others as well, but Chris directly wanted me to ask you, have you read the SSMP dust suppression plan? And if so, what do you feel are its weaknesses and its strengths? So maybe you could kick us off there, and if others want to add to it, that'd be great to hear.
Yeah, I think that any dust suppression is better than none. So first of all, I think that it's got to be a priority moving forward to keep as little mobilized as possible. I think the biggest need right now is kind of what I highlighted in the slides I was showing, is to know more about the composition. I think that as the sea shrinks, if indeed it's going to shrink as it's projected to, we need to know about what's coming up. We need to know about what's coming down the pipe, which in this case is going to be the sediments that are currently submerged that in the future will not be. And I think it's great that we're talking about things like crafting, ways to, you know, the kinds of furrows that will minimize the types of sediment that's going to become mobilized and aloft. I think that's great and that's important. I think that no mitigation is perfect, and that we need to know what and where we need to be most aware of in terms of the composition of these sediments that are going to become exposed. So I think and there are plans to put that into place, but I think that that's one thing that's really necessary to maximize our ability to keep people safe.
Thank you so much. Any other additions to that from folks? All right, let's move on to some of the other great questions we have. We have one from Blanca Villalobos, and they wrote, there is a Colorado River pump flow at the mouth of Whitewater Canyon that unifies the Whitewater River, and they are curious to know more about that and its relationship to the Salton Sea. Anyone know about this? Or if not, we can get back to Blanca maybe. Okay. All right. Here's a question for Miguel. So Miguel, you shared what kinds of community outreach that Comité Cívico is doing. And could you tell us more what you feel are the benefits and the outcomes of this engagement work, and why that this work is important in the long term as well as the short term for delivering on goals of environmental justice. So I guess that's what is the relationship between this work and its connection to environmental justice for people around the sea?
Yeah, great question. Well, most importantly, in order to have meaningful participation from community members, they have to know what's going on. Community members have other priorities before, thinking about the Salton Sea, thinking about air quality. The region has, one of the highest unemployment rates, which is of priority to put food on your table first. So for us to bring this information to them and provide them with the context of what's going on and try to have this meaningful conversations with them to spark the knowledge within them and try to learn more about this. When this opportunities for public input comes, they will have more informed input, therefore helping shape the way that the Salton Sea could potentially look, what those future projects could look like that are of actual benefit to them. They are the ones that live there, and they are the ones that need their own voices to be uplifted for them and their families. Those decisions of how projects could look like cannot be made or should not be made by those that live perhaps just out of the region, people in Sacramento, people out of the state perhaps. So those decisions need to be shaped by community members that will interact and will be at those projects. And, even so, own these projects, we also, part of our efforts is to advocate to have job opportunities. I mentioned unemployment. So, offering job opportunities, skill capacity for community residents to be part of these projects as well, and have a sense of ownership on those projects, and for them to have a good impact on their own lives and not be shaped, like I said, by an outsider.
Thank you for those really important points. Next question, just going to keep running us through. We're getting a couple questions about water importation, which is an understandable one to bring up. And so this is about the proposals to bring seawater from the Sea of Cortez through canals and tunnels to augment the Salton Sea. Folks are interested in knowing what is happening with that and what folks' perspectives are on if that's a feasible option for the Salton Sea. And I imagine several of our presenters will have thoughts on that. So I'll open it up to all to kind of share their perspectives.
I could jump in if you like. Yeah, and actually I sit on the erstwhile and maybe still existing long-range planning committee for the state of California for the Salton Sea. And we did review a number of projects, and none of them had done engineering or feasibility studies. We do know that there is a very low rise between the Gulf of California and the Salton Sea. Technically, you can bring water in fairly easily. The question is, there are a lot of questions, but among them is, what do you do when the water gets there? Because you're bringing salt water to a hypersaline lake. So it's either, let me just capsule it by saying it's technically feasible to do that. But the negotiations, the salinity problems, the costs put it in question. Meanwhile, the sea is in dire straits. So the thrust of the Sierra Club has been to move full steam ahead with current projects, which we absolutely need for public health and for ecosystem functioning, and then take a good hard look and do some engineering. And the state is going to do that to see whether these things are indeed feasible, given the obstacles.
Other thoughts from our presenters on this question of water importation?
I would agree with Joan from Audubon's point of view. Our focus really is to make sure there's habitat for the birds and wildlife and the air quality issues are solved. And we worry about this C2C import as a distraction right now. We have to focus on what's at hand, which is the immediate crisis for birds and people. And then sort of look longer term at this as one of many potential solutions. It would be very expensive and it would require a binational agreement. But again, our focus is what's in front of us right now.
Great, thanks so much. I know we need to wrap soon, so I just have a few more good ones I want to make sure we cover, and then we can wrap. So here's one, how far, and I think this may be for Will and Ryan, but others may again want to jump in. How far do you think the effects of air pollution from the Salton Sea playa will extend, and in what direction? How far?
This is a great question, and it's one that I'm actually working on right now for a number of reasons. One thing is that we know is that depending on the size of the particle, this kind of PM can be transported incredible distances. Now, of course, over time, it becomes more dispersed and it tends to become less concentrated. But we know from historic events that gas phase pollution, so that hydrogen sulfide, that H2s, that is a result of different changes within the sea, and then these sulfur emissions, that gets smelled when it occurs, sometimes as far away as Los Angeles. Like, you get this transport depending on seasonality, depending on wind patterns, that can go tremendous distances. I'm very interested in where we can expect to have particulates disperse from the shrinking Salton Sea, in part for the very topic of this webinar, which is to get people invested. I think that the health of the Salton Sea is important for the health of all of California, and I would like to convince the rest of the state that that's true. And I think part of that is to look at ways that we're tied together. And so, yes, I believe, and I'm working on resolving that these kinds of impacts in terms of the elevation of these contaminants can impact people far, far away. And of course, the closer you are, the more you're going to be impacted. But I think that it's important for us to look at impacts holistically and to look at things that affect people at a distance as also affecting us. And sometimes that can be very literally true, where we have these impacts that can travel great distances. So yes, I think that it does have importance, even directly for health, potentially for people that are not directly within the valley as well.
I have one more question for folks, but does anyone want to add to that before we move on? Okay. I'm going to wrap with a question that I'm going to pose to every presenter. And if you want to just provide kind of your brief thoughts on it to kind of close things out. And Dr. Porter, you teed this up very well, and maybe you've already given your answer. But the title of this webinar is why all of California should care about the Salton Sea. And so my question to all of the presenters is that one. Why, from your perspective of the work you're doing, your personal feelings, why do we need greater investment from all of California when it comes to caring for the Salton Sea and fixing these huge challenges there? If anyone wants to jump in and start us off, welcome that. And thanks for answering.
I'll start just by tagging on to what I said previously, which is that I think that it does affect potentially directly residents even far away from the region. And I think that in addition to that, one of the reasons I think this is such an important problem, and in some ways an opportunity, is that I believe that this is one example of ongoing environmental crises that are going to become increasingly frequent and prevalent across the planet. And I think that we as social creatures, as human beings in the communities, need to develop tools to address them in a way that allows us to be resilient together. And I think that being able to solve these kinds of problems in one part of the state is going to prepare us to solve problems in other parts of the state. Maybe that's going to be ocean level rise. Maybe that's going to be wildfires, whatever that is. I think that as a state, as a country, as a people, that it's going to be a crucial question about whether we can develop those skills that allow us to address these challenges remotely and in the future. And I think that's one area that we've struggled as a species to deal with problems, that if they're happening far away or if they're happening distance in time, sometime in the future, that's been our weak spot. And I think that this is an opportunity as a people to show that we can develop those tools. And the Salton Sea, I think, is a perfect place for us to develop that kind of tool framework.
And Joan here, I would add that Sierra Club has always worked to protect important places, be it save the Mineral King from becoming a Disneyland, keep Lake Tahoe blue. This is another instance of that, and on top of it, and it's such an underserved area, and it affects not only California but Mexico. So it's a justice issue, environmental and social justice issue.
And for us at Comité, one of the most important things is, of course, public health, right? Pollution knows no social economic levels. It would affect us all equally. And just like Dr. Porter had mentioned, those that live adjacent and immediate to the Salton Sea will be impacted the most, but eventually it could be the whole state. So, it is important, this windblown dust will travel miles and miles, even across the border. So again, pollution knows no socioeconomic levels, knows no borders. Everyone that lives in the region will be impacted. So that's one of the main reasons that everybody should care about the Salton Sea and be part of it, be part of this, power of engagement and to be able to create that political will to actually make an important, significant change and solutions for the Salton Sea.
Thanks, Miguel. And I would say from Audubon's point of view, it's an integral part of the Pacific Flyway. People like to say it's an accident. Why does it matter? Because it was just an accident. Doesn't matter if you consider it an accident or not. It's there and it's a surrogate habitat. For a lot of birds, it's all that's left. So it's really important. And like others have said, if this was Lake Tahoe, it wouldn't have been ignored for so long. But it's time to pay attention to this region for the people and the birds that live there. If we don't have the Salton Sea, we're going to lose a massive part of the Pacific Flyway.
I want to kind of peg on to everybody, what everybody else said, but also the bit about the Pacific Flyway is, it's also an environmental stewardship issue because originally, the Pacific Flyway was along the coast, and since we decided to move in there, it comes through the Salton Sea. I'm not sure how much of it in 1800s or whatever, but definitely that's a stewardship issue. It's also like in addition to the contaminants moving around and understanding how we're managing these kind of lakes and these kind of issues, we also really need to understand how to manage environmental justice. I think this whole data management thing, the Audubon's leading out on that to try to build up a data dashboard to collect data, but also community participation and environmental justice has just been around for 30 years or so as defined environmental justice. But we really have to figure out how to get this participation from community into these kind of processes, and this is a great place to do it. So yeah.
Okay, great. Anything else on that? All right, Danya, unless you don't want to add, I'll move. Okay, you're good. Okay, I'm going to move us to our last slide. Thank you. First of all, huge thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to everyone for staying on later. I should have known, we all should have known that with so much great information, we would totally run over, and everyone was a trooper for sticking on. So thank you so much. Really appreciate that. We're going to send a follow-up email with the recording, and we're happy to include all the contact info and links from all of the different presenters that were shared today in that, so that everyone knows how to follow up, get more information, has the recording of the webinar, and then for taking action, we want to encourage you from the Sierra Club to sign this petition that we have here, which is how you can plug into the campaign work we're doing and get more involved. As Danya went over and others added to, there are a lot of public engagement opportunities coming up where you can participate in making sure you're speaking up on behalf of the sea, the birds there, the people who live around the sea, and being an ally to the Salton Sea and the region. So please consider getting plugged into opportunities to show up at those meetings. And we're here to kind of coach you on talking points, how to kind of frame comments. And then if you're local, please get involved with the Sierra Club Chocolates group. The Facebook group has been, the link has been pinged in the chat here. Thank you, Marianne. And then if you're outside of the region, feel free to email me, and I'm really delighted to get you plugged in to the work that we're doing. So again, we'll email this all out for folks. Thanks for everyone so much for sticking in. This was a fabulous presentation. Can't thank you all enough for making this happen today. And we're gonna do this again. So we'll see you at the next one. All right, take care.